Lounge with Alan B. Smith. Rebroadcast on the Onyx Network. Thursdays at 11 p.m. Pacific. Fridays at 2 a.m. Eastern.
However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Mystic Lounge. I'm Alan B. Smith, your grateful host. I have a great guest on tonight, a subject that is historically dear to my heart, and that is mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms to be specific. However, tonight we're looking at it from a different perspective, or difference actually probably not the right word, and I'll let our guest describe it better than I, because her book, the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, focuses mostly on the effects of psychedelic use for women, because that is a subject that has not been really fleshed out very well in the literature and in the science, which we'll talk about. Jennifer Chesak is my guest. Jennifer, welcome to Mystic Lounge. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy you're here. This is a really different take on the psychedelic conversation, and it's
Yes.
obviously a much needed one. It's come up on the channel before, how you know women are gaslighted when
Mm.
it comes to medical issues, psychological and otherwise. But it hadn't even occurred to me that that would occur within the psychedelic community, because one thinks of one love, the communal spirit of the whole thing, expanding one's mind, becoming a better person, healing, all of that. So to think that there's something that was missed somehow was a little bit of a surprise to me. But then I started reading your book, I was like, oh, okay, I see it, especially the medical and the scientific aspect of it. So let's talk about your sojourn in the beginning, that really was the inception of the longer journey of your uncovering of the benefits, pros and cons, and potential future of psychedelics for women and everyone too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a journalist and a fact checker, and I focus on science and medical journalism mostly. And then I've always had a fascination with psychedelics as well. And I'm super passionate about women's health because I'm a woman myself, and I've had many medical problems in my life, and I've experienced the gaslighting firsthand and in the doctor's office, and it's been really, really frustrating. And setting out to write the book, I came across some interesting research in that it's actually that in many cases, more women are using psychedelics more frequently than men are. And that came as a bit of a surprise to me. I just
Hmm.
thought it would be more men. And this comes from the Global Drug Survey of 2020. And when I dug a little deeper, it made sense to me. And because there's tends to be a difference in the way that men and women use psychedelics. So men traditionally, not all of them, tend to use psychedelics a little bit more recreationally. There's nothing wrong with that. And again, this is from the Global Drug Survey of 2020. Whereas women are turning to psychedelics to self treat, and they're doing that because they're not getting adequate care in the mainstream medical system in many cases. So they're self treating conditions like PTSD, trauma, depression, anxiety, also chronic pain, any conditions related to the menstrual cycle, things like that. Because again, they're just finding a lot of frustration in the mainstream medical system. And I always like to back up my information with facts too, and share this little timeline on what am I talking about the mainstream medical system. So I'm not against the mainstream medical system because I am a science and medical journalist. I just wanted to share that first. But I do have some problems with it as a woman, especially. So, women were largely excluded from early stage clinical trials until around 1993, so the early 90s.
That's
And
crazy. Since like the study of it's been since like not psilocybin itself, but hasn't psychedelics gone back all the way to like the early 30s?
Yeah, well, I'm actually just talking about psychedelics I mean, not, medical medical studies in general, so not just psychedelics. We were excluded from all clinical trials
It's
until
astounding.
the
Wow.
1990s, yeah, and so this has had huge ramifications for women's health. So it's, if we think about this timeline, so men got a drug for male sexual dysfunction in 1998, and everyone knows what that is. You can tell me, right?
We had a presidential runner sharing information about that. So yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, Viagra, household name.
Mhm.
At that point in time, the medical community, let alone anyone that a woman might have been sleeping with, didn't have an adequate picture of what the clitoris looks like. There's all this internal structure to the clitoris, and that didn't occur until 2005, if you could believe that, that a female
Mhm. Yeah.
urologist finally did some research and learned, the full scale of the clitoris. So we finally find the clitoris in 2005, and then it wasn't until 2015 that women finally got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. And so that's a 17-year gap from when dudes got a drug to when women
Mhm.
got a drug for the same condition, even though obviously sexual dysfunction affects the male body and the female body differently. I just like to share that timeline because it shows the
Yeah.
frustrations I think that women have really faced. And so putting this book out that's really focusing on the intersection of women's health and
Mhm.
psilocybin felt really important because if women are using psychedelics to self-treat, I certainly want them to be able to do that in a very safe way and a way that where they have all the information with the context for their bodies, including the menstrual cycle and things like that.
Right. And so, what about your journey?
Ah, so you want to know about my journey?
What about
Yeah.
your
So
journey? Yeah.
I thought you were asking about the journey of the
Oh,
book,
no, I
but
am too. Yeah, it's
okay.
all that context is important because it ties in directly to your personal experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, my personal experience, I was always really afraid of doing psychedelics before. And then, I dove into getting this book deal, and it was like, well, I can't accurately write about psychedelics without actually trying it. I've always been interested in doing a psychedelic, but just didn't really feel like I had the knowledge or the information that would help me have the best experience possible. Not that you can control your experience, but obviously you can set yourself up for a good experience.
Sure.
And I just never felt like I was in the right space to do that. But with the book deal, I felt like I just could not accurately write about psychedelics without diving in myself. And I'm so glad I did because it ended up being one of the most profound experiences of my life. So I hired an underground guide and we met at a cabin in the woods in a safe way. I mean, he brought a female trip sitter and we had a lot of conversations before I met with him, but it's
Mhm.
always really funny when I'm like, I went to a cabin in the woods with a complete stranger to do
Well, you make
drugs.
you make that very clear in the book that you
I
did thorough research. You didn't
I
just
did.
wander into some random, jungle hut, right?
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. It
yeah.
wasn't like that. But yeah, it was a really profound experience. I think two things that I'll share is the I did two journeys. So one night and then one the next day.
Mhm.
And the first journey was about roughly 2 grams of psilocybin. And one of the most profound things I felt was as if I was connected by points of light to everyone that I know and love and who I know loves me back. And I could feel their love coming to me. And I was sending love on these almost like electrical currents.
Mhm.
And I think that felt so profound because, a lot of times we know we have a support system, but to really feel that in your body it's magical. I mean, to be cliche, it's very magical. But then the next day, I did a deeper dose, so about 3.5 grams throughout the day. And eventually I hit peak dose. And I did feel some anxiety come up. And at first I was kind of like, I want to unsubscribe from this experience, but you can't. You're on that roller coaster, right? And so you can't get off.
Right.
And
Yep.
which is okay, and I think the important thing to understand is the more you resist it, the worse it's going to be. So if you just sit with it, that can be really helpful. And I'm so glad that I just, kind of sat there and let the mushroom take me where it needed me to go.
Yeah, yeah.
And something that I've been struggling with a lot in my life, in recent years is that I have aging parents, and I know that this is a cycle of life. They will end up passing away someday, but that does give me a lot of anxiety, and I felt like on the other side of their deaths there will just be unending grief and I'll never be okay again. It'll just be like dark life forever. And I had to really confront my anxiety about that because That's not necessarily true, you know? Again, we lose people in our lives, but anyway, I sat with that feeling and considered it, and it felt like the mushroom was showing me really challenging things that I had gotten through in the past. So,
Mhm.
you know, it was almost like this reel of challenging things going through my mind, and that sounds terrifying, but it wasn't. It was just showing me, "Hey, you've been okay before, even though you've dealt with really complicated and difficult things." And you will be okay on the other side of this. Yes, there will be grief, you will be sad, but you have a support system. You are, you know, you have the tools to get through tough situations, and this
Exactly.
will
Yeah.
be no different. And on the other side of that, like, little stretch of time, it was roughly 10 minutes where I felt, you know, anxiety and discomfort. I felt the most immense peace and euphoria that I've ever felt in my life, and it was just the mushroom essentially telling me, yeah, you're gonna be okay, girl. It's gonna be all right. So it was really beautiful.
Is it when you're saying it's telling you you're gonna be okay, what is that like? Is that your own subconscious speaking to you? What is that?
You know, researchers have a really great way of explaining like what actually happens
Mhm.
during a magic mushroom trip because I feel like it feels so abstract to most people unless you've
Yeah.
done some research like this.
Mhm.
But the model is called the Rebus model, REBUS, and this was
Mhm.
created by Dr. Carhart Harris and Dr. Carl J. Friston, prolific psychedelic researchers, and they're amazing. And I love this model because it really explains things well. So we think about when we were kids, our minds were super flexible, and that's because we hadn't really formulated our ideas about ourselves, so our identity, and we hadn't formulated like how we think the world operates around us.
Mhm.
And but you know, obviously that as we get into adulthood, those pathways of thinking become really rigid, and that's because we do form our identities, and we do form those thoughts about how the world around us operates, and those belief systems can just become super rigid, and we often have negative beliefs about ourselves or the world, and that can lead to problems that can cause, or it can be part of depression and anxiety, body image issues, all sorts
Mhm.
of things. But they came up with this really great analogy to explain it, and I just love this. I'm so glad we're on a screen because it involves hand movements. But
Okay, good.
so in a normal state of consciousness, we can think of that really rigid brain as almost like a frozen pond. So it's ice. Now, if you were to try to take a new belief, let's say you're trying to change a thought that you have about yourself, and you think of that as a rock, and now you're going to drop that on a frozen pond, it doesn't do anything. It just goes thunk. It doesn't gain
Mhm.
entry. Nothing happens. Maybe it
Yeah.
cracks a little. I don't know, but it doesn't really. Nothing happens. Now, on a psychedelic, it's like we have a thawed pond. Now we've got water. Now we take that rock in the form of a new belief. We drop it in. It gains entry and it causes a ripple effect. And I just love that analogy because I think it helps to understand like why do psychedelics potentially work for things like PTSD, depression,
Yeah.
trauma, stuff like
Right.
that. It's because we're able to actually change our minds in that altered state of consciousness. And then when we're back in a normal state of consciousness, it sticks. You know, I mean, it's good to do some integration. So, like in psychedelic assisted therapy is often followed up with
Mhm.
integration, where you're learning from what the insights that came up for you were. We're learning from those. You can do integration by journaling. You
Mhm.
can join community integration circles. There's plenty online so that you don't have to go anywhere or be in a state where it's legal or anything
Mhm.
like that. You can do integration with people on Zoom and stuff. And so yeah, you do have to do some work, but generally like that, it has a lasting effect. And you compare that to an antidepressant. Antidepressants you got to take pretty much every day. And now we know that psilocybin research is showing that some of those results, those beneficial effects, especially on depression, can last for like 6 months, even possibly up to a year. We still need more research to determine exactly how long, but it's a lasting effect, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, it is. Those studies are promising, but like you say multiple times in the book, is we need more. We need more
Yes,
studies
we do.
to really understand that and how what the efficacy really is.
Of course.
But it does seem that the majority of people who do have a therapeutic controlled use, whether it's in the shamanic sense or with a clinical psychiatrist,
Right.
regulating the amount and guiding them through their trip, that they can come out of it positively change. One of the things I thought was really interesting was it seems like some conditions um, weren't improved, but the person, their their behavior or their mood or how they dealt with it improved.
Yeah.
That's what things
Um,
like the physicality wasn't changed, but somehow how does that how do you explain that the person can say I didn't feel an improvement, but yet I'm functioning better in the world.
Yeah, and I think that was very prevalent in a study on premenstrual dysphoric disorder, where it wasn't that it less necessarily lessened the symptoms of
Mhm.
premenstrual dysphoric disorder, but it did make people more able to deal with their symptoms. And I don't necessarily have a direct, explanation for that because researchers haven't provided that yet. But what we do know through research, especially with depression, and this is really fascinating. So if we think about depression, one of the most common things that you take would be an antidepressant, or which is
Mhm.
usually a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. There are SNRIs as well, and there's all sorts of them. But SSRIs tend to blunt your mood. That's how they work. So not
Mhm.
only do they blunt your lows, which is what people are going for, but they also blunt your highs. And so that can be problematic. But what we're finding through research on psilocybin, especially related to depression, is that instead of blunting your mood, it makes you
Mhm.
feel more okay with your highs and lows. And so I think that's going on in some of these
Right.
other studies too. So if we think about the premenstrual dysphoric disorder study, it made people more able to deal with their symptoms, or maybe it was fibromyalgia, things like that. There's all these different conditions that I listed in the book, and then shared the research related to those. But I think that is often what is potentially happening. There's some other research that shows that it can reduce the expression of certain pain signals that happen in the body, and so people might be noticing lessening of pain with certain chronic pain conditions. Again, we need more research on that to
Mhm.
to really show that those benefits are there. But it is really exciting to see that this research is going on.
So that thing with the high and the low, does
Mhm.
is that the zombie effect that people feel when they're on antidepressants? Like, is that what they're reporting? Like, there's not because I had taken an
Yeah.
antidepressant like a long, long, long time ago, and I was young and I was still drinking a lot, so it wasn't going to work for me. They were not compatible. But I remember that
Sure.
feeling of just kind of being like, mm, like
Yeah.
my hands were clammy, and I just felt like not fully alive. It was a weird sensation.
I know the feeling. I'm not on SSRI now, but I was in my early 30s, and I'm like 45 now, just to give you some context. So that was a long time ago. But I also noticed the same thing. Like, I was always someone who, if I were sitting and watching a movie or something on TV, and then like a sappy commercial came on, I'd get teary eyed. Or if I was
Yeah,
watching
yeah.
an emotional movie, I would get
Mhm.
teary eyed. This was before I started taking the SSRIs. And then when I was on the SSRI, I noticed that didn't happen, and it bothered me because I liked those moments of, like, really feeling for characters in a movie, or,
Mhm.
again, just, like, getting a little weepy over a commercial just for in a good way, and that was gone. And so I think, again, we're blunting our emotions when we're on those medications, and I there's nothing wrong with those medications. They're great medications, and they're helping a lot of people,
Sure.
and they're necessary to be out there, so I don't wanna encourage anyone to go off of their medications, or with especially without talking to their doctor and figuring out a safe way to taper off, because it's also really hard to get off of them. But I do want to encourage people, if you are suddenly thinking that you're dealing with some depression, to have a conversation with your doctor about what are the alternatives to these sorts of things in terms of SSRIs. Are there other alternatives? And clearly there are, and that's not to say that psilocybin is right for everyone. It's not, but it may be something that is appropriate for you in the right context.
Right. Speaking of the SSRI and tapering off, in the book you talk about comparing uh, someone who is either pregnant or having just given birth and coming off of antidepressants compared to someone who was microdosing. I forget her name, but you gave a specific example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I was actually writing about her name is Hilary Agro. She's a really great activist. She lives in Canada and she's also a PhD anthropology student. She's fabulous. But
Mhm.
she talks a lot about how when she was pregnant, she had to take her ADHD medication. So there was ADHD medication, and
Yep.
she stayed on it while pregnant, and she had to make a choice about that because it's one of those things that so yes, there's some research out there that if you're on ADHD medication while pregnant, it could potentially cause birth defects. But
Right.
the research is not very good. Like we need more research on that. And it seems like it's a rare consideration. But what she felt like is I can't be pregnant and I can't parent properly if I'm not on that medication. And so she had to make an appropriate choice for
Yeah.
herself. And then I interviewed another woman, and her name is Michaela De La Mico. She goes by Mama De La Mico on Instagram, and she works with women that are trying to want to manage their menstrual cycle using like microdosing and things like that, and other plant medicines. But she shared her story of she was pregnant and she chose to use psilocybin while pregnant
Hmm.
because it helped her abstain from alcohol. She said she had a problem with alcohol, and this actually helped her abstain from it. Now, I don't know what doses she was taking or how often while
Hmm.
pregnant, but in the United States and elsewhere around the globe, we have some blanket statements about, oh, you can't be on anything if you're pregnant. And I
Hmm.
understand the blanket statement. It's for safety reasons because we don't do clinical trials on pregnant people, and we don't, do clinical trials on breastfeeding people to see how it affects their infants. Or we don't do clinical trials on infants like that at all. And
Right.
so,
Right. That makes sense.
yeah, it totally makes sense. And I
Yeah.
understand why we have these blanket statements, but we also have indigenous wisdom to pull from. And so, what Hilary Agro was telling
Hmm.
me is that, she's researched this at length, and there's no evidence of harm in indigenous communities of pregnant women using psychedelics, or specifically psilocybin is what we were talking about. Of course, we don't have evidence of safety either, so I never want to be reductive about
Sure.
that. But I do want to say that it's important that we consider the health of the pregnant person just as
Hmm.
much as we consider the health of a fetus. And if that pregnant person is unhealthy, that affects the fetus. And so we really need to be able to have some more open conversations about that. It shouldn't just be a blanket statement. It may um, we need to think about the context of the individual.
Yeah. And there was a case where someone had reported
Oh,
her
yes.
to family social services.
Yes. So
And
she
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this happened to Hillary, and it
Yeah.
was related to she's a prolific activist in encouraging people to talk about their drug use openly if they're safe to do so, of course. But
Mhm.
she says like, "Hey, I'm a drug user, and this person's a drug user, and it's like if you had coffee this morning, you're a drug user because you had caffeine. If you drank a glass of wine tonight before watching this Zoom, you're a drug user, right?" So she's open
Mhm.
about being a drug user, and it's not that she's like rampantly using a bunch of illicit substances, but she says, "I'm on ADHD medication. I'm a drug user." And her point is that we need to stop treating certain drug users as bad, quote unquote bad, and
Right.
other drug users as okay because it's caffeine or whatever. So she's a staunch advocate of this. And someone used that against her, and they reported her to Child Protective Services in Canada. And so she had to go through this whole process of like explaining that, hey, no, I'm an activist, I'm a PhD student, I talk about this openly.
Mhm.
But the point here is that we shouldn't be weaponizing children against women or
Yeah.
parents in general based on some of these things. Sometimes people you know turn to psilocybin, and there's a whole contingency of moms on mushrooms out there. I'm sure you've heard of MOM, Moms on Mushrooms by Tracy T. It's a great community. They're openly talking about, hey, yeah, I'm microdosing as a parent.
And
And
you also have
so
like
I'm
Sisters and Psychedelics, the
yeah,
other
Sisters and
right.
Psychedelics,
Yeah.
yes. all of these different organizations that I just really appreciate. And
Mhm.
I'm glad that we're having conversations. We're opening the floor for conversation. And I hope that changes some of the stigma, especially around psychedelics.
What do you think men can take from this? I mean, obviously, I'm reading the book and I'm understanding the effect on a woman's body and mind in a better way, which is enlightening. But besides that, besides like the pure like physical science, like what do you think men should take away?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of men reach out to me or they talk to me at events and things like that, and they are buying the book for, maybe it's a partner, a mother, a sister, a friend.
Mhm.
And I love that because they're also telling me like, hey, I've had experience with psychedelics, but I want to be able to present this to, whomever I'm giving it to so that I am not going in and acting like the expert and like mansplaining this content about a female, like
Mhm.
the female body to someone.
Right.
And I love that. So I really appreciate that. And I think that's a really important takeaway is that, yes, just because you've had experience with a psychedelic doesn't mean that you're the expert. Like I'm not an expert,
Oh,
even though I've written about it and dove into it so much. We want to open the floor for a conversation with people rather than like trying to explain our expertise to them. And I think
yeah.
that's important regardless of gender, but it also is really important in terms of when a man is talking to a woman, you don't want to be mansplaining because it's rude and it
Yeah,
happens,
and the thing is, like, and oftentimes in defense of men,
Yeah,
they don't mean it that way,
I
but,
know.
like, you're kinda programmed, like, so there's things moments in my life where I've, like, done something, and then my wife has enlightened me, and they're like, "Oh my lord," like, I can't believe but I look back, I'm like, "Oh, I see where that came from," you know? Like,
Sure.
there was a time where I had, made a phone call and reported someone, and it created more trauma for that. And this is long, years ago, but
Mhm.
I've will never make a mistake like that again. And also, I was in a really bad place at the time,
I
like, and
understand.
I was
Yeah.
around some bad people that were not helpful. But I did this thing, and it's one of those things that I just regret because I know the trauma that I caused that person. And even though I was well
Sure.
intended, I thought that I was being well intended. You know.
I think we've all had moments like that, and it's not just men, I'm guilty. I have my own brand of it that I call Jensplaining.
I
So,
like that. Well, I'm
yeah,
appreciating your Jensplaining right now. That's cool.
So, like, I try not to do it if but it happens, so,
Um, right. And then the other experience I'll share with you too
Mhm.
is earlier you kind of mentioned how men tend to do the drug more so than women recreationally.
Sure.
That was very true in my younger years. But it was also like, I want to get in touch with the universe, man. Um, but then sometime later, I did use psilocybin. And the intent was solely like I had an intention. Like, I really wanted to, like, grow from it, learn something from it. It was very and it was the worst trip I had ever had.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was terrible. And I think it was an OD situation.
Like, you had too much is
Way
what you're
too
saying.
much, way too much.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I like to share that because
Yeah.
even though I do believe that there's many positives to all this, that it should be used responsibly, you know?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't have any problem with people using magic mushrooms recreationally. I think there can be a benefit to that on occasion to do that, but I think it's really important to if you are having an intention to work on something that is done in a more therapeutic context, meaning that you're not at a festival, maybe you're with a friend or you're with a guide or a psychedelic assisted therapist
Mhm,
and all of that. And then one thing too to keep in mind with if you have an intention of thinking that you want to work on something, instead of setting that very specific intention before you go into a journey, it what I'm learning from other people and myself as well is that it can be really helpful to just set the intention of being open minded to let the mushroom take you
mhm.
where your mind wants to take it, because it's
Yeah.
really just working on your own mind. We think of the mushroom as controlling things, but it's really what's happening in your mind that is
Right.
doing that. And I think if you try to force working on something, that can lead to perhaps a negative experience. Whereas if you
Yeah.
just let that intention be to let the situation unfold as it may, which can be
Hmm.
hard. We like to have control, right? I mean, I'm someone who likes to be in control, and it can be hard to give up that control, but it can lead to having a better experience. And that's proven through research as well, or shown through survey research, where people have reported that when they had a bad journey, it was because they were trying to force something and whatnot, so
Yeah, or resist. I think, and that's I think
resist.
what
Yeah.
happened to me, because I had like in my mind what I wanted to achieve, which wasn't happening, and what was happening, I was really like fighting it, and then that's where it was like something snapped, and I just went off on a really really bad trip. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that resistance can really crop up, and I'm sorry you had a bad trip, that's not fun, but, I think that, where we can get in trouble with resistance, or where that can happen, is that when our minds are trying to force us under a psychedelic to look at trauma, we're naturally going to resist that, because in our normal states of consciousness, we don't want to think about our traumas, and we don't actively think about them because they're so triggering. And so when you're on a psychedelic, of course, we know psychedelics can help with trauma, and I can explain a little bit about that, but I can gensplain. but
Yeah, I would
but
love
my
to hear that actually. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I'll dig into that. But I think what happens is that when we start to move towards looking at that trauma on a psychedelic, we naturally resist it because we think we're going to have that trigger. But the
Mm,
important thing to remember, and this can be really helpful, is that when you're on a psychedelic, the trauma is not as triggering, and generally the triggers are removed. And there's a really great analogy that a researcher named Dr. Gregor Hassler, I think he's in Germany, his analogy for why this happens, or why we can look at trauma safely on a psychedelic, is he calls it the helioscope effect. So a helioscope is an
mhm.
instrument that scientists use to look at the sun, and because you're not supposed to look at the directly at the
Right.
sun, pro tip there. But this instrument, we can think of this as an analogy for when you're on the psychedelic too. So
Mhm.
we don't look at the sun directly because we'll get burned, but on with the helioscope you can look at it without getting burned. The same thing is true with a psychedelic. It acts like a helioscope for our trauma. We can, on a psychedelic, view our traumas from like a safe distance and through a
Mhm.
new lens, not get burned. It's almost like we have these safety filters on. So you won't get burned by the trauma generally on a psychedelic, because you're going to have some things happening in the brain that that are concerned with your fear center and your anxiety,
Mhm.
the center of your anxiety, which is the amygdala. And so we just have that sort of taken away. And with that new lens, you can reprocess your trauma, and then when you're back in a normal state of consciousness, it may not feel as triggering anymore. So that's a really beautiful thing about psychedelics and trauma.
Yeah, we hear that often about people being able to step outside of themselves and kind of
Yeah.
look like they're looking at their own history, their own memories from the outside in. Um, and you're right, there's that whole biochemistry, which is you go into detail, which I can't get into right now,
It's
but that
okay.
explains like sort of like mechanisms, right, of how that is,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder where are you with the more like mystical aspect of this? Because we talk about consciousness on this podcast a lot,
Hmm.
and I'm always kind of like back and forth because okay, so the next guest, we'll be talking about physics, quantum
Okay.
physics,
Ooh.
and like I don't know if you're familiar with like the two split experiment.
Yes, a little
Yeah,
bit.
a little bit. Okay, so there's that, and then there's also something I learned, which I had no idea. Another mystery of quantum mechanics is that like when you're looking at a pane of glass, right? Photons hit the glass,
Hmm.
4% bounce back, the rest go through. They can't figure out why. There's zero mathematical evidential reason why a certain number of photons just decide to bounce off the glass. Like so there's these like
Hmm.
fundamental mysteries in like the physics of our makeup. And then you have something like the
Yeah.
two split experiment, where it seems like the photons or the electrons choose when to go through a slit or not, depending on whether a human is looking at it. It's
I
insanity. It's
know.
insanity, and it doesn't even
It
matter. Like, you
is.
could use a camera and not be looking at it directly, and it knows. So
Right?
it's one of those most bizarre, physics, quantum physics facts, that even like Neil deGrasse Tyson's like, yeah, I don't know what it is, but
I
I
don't
can't say it's not real because we can measure it over and over again. So then that brings us back to like consciousness. So what's that interaction of consciousness with reality? So then
Yeah.
when you're on something like a psychedelic, do you think that you're tapping into something else? Or do you think that it's just all really like the brain mechanism?
I mean, I think it's a bit of several things all at once. Definitely
Mhm.
what's happening in the brain. And so the neurobiology, the neuroscience of all of that. And it's
Sure.
working on your subconscious, but that doesn't mean that it's not somehow mystical. And so I think there's elements too where, yeah, we could be tapping into a level of consciousness where we all have this connection to each other and the universe at large, but we're not able to really access that connection in
Mhm.
a normal state of consciousness. Now, I have no like basis of research for that. That's just kind of like a belief I have about it, is that, yeah, we are all connected and there's all this energy happening, but we're not able to really access that in a normal state of consciousness, is my
Mhm.
guess. I don't know, but
I
yeah,
mean,
and I think, oh, go ahead.
do you feel that in like a Jungian way, like a psychological
Yeah,
archetype, or okay?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. It's really hard to explain, and I could probably make my head spin thinking about
Yeah,
it too
yeah.
much. But it is such a magical thing. And we talk about in psychedelics there are mystical experiences,
Mhm.
and I think that a level is happening just with the neurobiology, but then also there is some element that we just can't explain.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
have people who report being able to talk to their ancestors after, when they're in a journey and stuff, or like seeing people they've never met and that are ancient ancestors of theirs. And,
Mhm.
I have no idea how that happens. And I can't explain that in a scientific way. I do think it's pretty cool though, and fascinating. And then we also hear about that the more mystical your experience is, or if it feels really mystical to you,
Mhm.
that tends to be some of the most profound experiences people have.
Right.
People report that even if they've had a negative experience on a psychedelic, that it's still one of the most profound experiences of
Mhm.
their lives. But what also elevates that profoundness is when they do have a mystical experience, and that could be so many different things. Could be a level of mysticism. And again, it could be that feeling of what's called oceanic boundlessness, that connection to, and I think that's a Freudian term, and there's a French mystic that
Mhm.
coined it with him. But it's, that oceanic boundlessness is that sort of connection that we feel to others when we're on a psychedelic that we don't necessarily feel in a normal state of consciousness. Although it can be lasting, you can feel that connection after you're done with your journey.
Yeah, it kinda hangs with you for a little while,
It
right?
does, yeah.
So how do we, what what's the benefit of dosing versus taking higher doses of psilocybin?
That's a great question. I think they can support each other. So I'm a huge advocate for going and having a deeper dose, so a macro dose. So thinking like 3 grams or something like that. You can start small and work your way up. That
I
doesn't
think
mean you
I think
you.
I may have done 9 grams, I'm not sure.
Oh my gosh, that
I
is a
don't
heroic
I
dose.
don't know
That's what
what it
that's
was, but that's what it
called.
felt like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a
You're
Terence McKenna thing, the heroic
the heroic
dose.
dose.
Yeah,
Yes, I was
yeah.
gonna say it's one of those guys. I couldn't remember if it was McKenna
Mm,
or not, but I thought so. But yeah, so I think like that you get a lot of insights from doing a macro dose. So again,
mhm.
like 3 grams or so. A heroic dose is over 5 grams, and I wouldn't recommend anyone start out with that or anything like that. But you can
Definitely not.
eventually get
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
But with then with microdosing, that's really like a tenth of a gram. So it's so minuscule. So just explaining to people who aren't aware. So that when you're on mini microdose there, you aren't really feeling those psychedelic effects. Like you're not having visuals or I mean, you would be safe to drive and everything like that, which I would not recommend on a macro dose, and definitely not on a heroic dose, but
No,
definitely
no.
no. That would be unsafe.
I
But yeah,
did
with
drive
that,
on
okay.
LSD once a long
Did
time
you? Oh
ago.
gosh.
Don't do that either.
I would not
It
recommend.
was on the way
No.
to see the Blair Witch Project, so that was a
Oh
night.
gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. And we
That
had no
sounds
idea
like a
what we were getting
story.
into. I know, I know. Yeah.
That sounds like quite
So
a story. I think we all remember like the day we saw the Blair Witch Project, don't we?
I think so. That's so
It's
funny you
so
say that. Like,
funny.
I think most people do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had a date with a guy and he took me there on his motorcycle. We watched the Blair Witch and then I never saw him again. I mean, on purpose on my part, but
Right. Right.
anyway,
But yeah, I think because it was so novel,
it
it
was.
truly was
And I thought it was
groundbreaking. Yeah.
real because there was that, it was like found
Hmm.
footage and it was advertised. This was before the days of like heavy internet use where you would
Yeah.
learn these things. I was just like, oh, this is like a real footage
Right.
and this really happened. And then I realized, oh, okay, never mind. It's a movie.
I'm
But
sorry,
yeah,
I got
in
you off track. Yeah.
no, no, you're fine. In terms of microdosing, what I think is really beneficial is choosing one of the protocols to follow. There's a couple that I list in the book that are the most common, like the Stamets stack and the Fadiman protocol are pretty common ones to follow, and that can be really useful for tapping back into some of your insights. Again, you're not going to be having psychedelic effects on like visuals on a microdose, but it can reconnect you to your macro dose, if that makes sense. It can bring
Mhm.
back some of those insights if they've faded for you. And also, I think it can be just a tool in between macro doses. So, you don't want to be macro dosing constantly, or you're not going to be able
Oh,
to
no.
work. And
Right.
it might be really fun, but it's probably not a great idea. Plus, you would build up a tolerance, and over time, it would lose its efficacy for you. So you want to macro dose. Like I recommend something like once a quarter, once every 6 months, maybe once a year, depending on the person and their individual needs. It's going to differ from person to person. And then microdosing in between that, if you feel like that's something that you want to do. And I think that it can also be a really great tool for behavior change. So people use psychedelics a lot for like trying to make a behavior change, especially an addicting behavior, whether that's smoking cessation, alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder.
Mhm.
People are turning to psychedelics for that. And we are getting some really good research, especially with psilocybin for all of those things. And so, but it doesn't happen magically. It's not like you're just I'm going to do a macro dose and then I'm not going to drink anymore. It's just not how it works. I mean, you may find that you have fewer drinking days after using a psychedelic, but part of it is also what you're leaning into your own motivation and making
Mhm.
sure that you're actually taking part in that behavior change. So saying, even if you have a craving like for an alcohol, then being like, oh, you know what, I don't really need this, or do I need
Yeah.
it, or like what's the thought process about that. And so I think microdosing can really help support some of those behavior changes that you're
Mhm.
trying to make, especially if that was your goal with going into, trying a psychedelic.
Um, you used a term, and I'm trying to like go through my notes and find it. Oh, I can't. It was instead of alcoholism, you used alcohol
Alcohol use
use
disorder?
disorder.
Mhm. Yeah.
Is that the new vernacular
Yeah,
for alcoholism,
yeah.
or
Right. Yeah. So, we know that it is a disease and it's not necessarily, it's like not a choice, it's a chronic disease that occurs. And as you go through, as you develop alcohol use disorder, which can happen for a number of reasons, you really get locked into that cycle. Now, that's not to say that you don't have choices. Of course, we all have choices. But, alcohol use disorder is just a really clinical term rather than using something like, instead of saying, oh, that person's an alcoholic, or
Mhm.
we say opioid use disorder now too, as opposed to that person's an addict or a junkie. It's just a more professional way of saying something and
Sure.
a kinder way, and understanding that, again, even with especially with opioid use disorder, like once you're locked into that addiction, it is very hard to get out of that without assistance and in some form or fashion.
In your research, how much do you think the addictive part of it is the brain versus the like some say it's a natural genetic susceptibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we all have I mean, not all of us have that genetic predisposition. I mean, other
Predisposition.
people,
Yeah.
yeah, people have that, for specific reasons genetically, but then, even if someone who doesn't have that predisposition, through genetics is, suddenly using heroin or taking opioid pills of some sort, like Percocet or
Yeah.
something,
Mhm.
over time, that messes with your reward pathways, so your dopamine and
Mhm.
stuff, and so you're getting less and less of the dopamine that you're seeking by using a substance. The dopamine hit doesn't really give you the same effects anymore, but you keep going for it. And then, of course, especially with opioid use disorder, if you stop all of a sudden, you're going to get dope sick essentially. And that is, I mean, I don't have firsthand experience, but I've had friends who've had it, and it's a miserable, awful experience to be
Mhm.
dope sick. And so you just all you're doing at that point, rather than actually getting high, is just you're seeking the drug to prevent that dope sickness because it's so miserable for your body. And that's why, and it's actually dangerous to just quit cold turkey. So that's why people need to go to treatment centers for these sorts of things. But
But there's gotta be that psychological aspect to it though,
of
right?
course,
Like,
yeah.
because yes, some people can get addicted because they were prescribed, but then, like for myself when I was younger, I used alcohol as a coping mechanism,
Sure, yeah. Mhm.
psychologically, and then eventually you use it enough, then it's like the body, you need those dopamine hits, and the only way you can get that is by using.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think we can think about it too, with our phones. Like, how many of us are addicted to just like scrolling through Instagram or whatever? I mean, I admit that I do it, and
Yeah.
you're sitting there, you're scrolling, and you've seen what you needed to see, but then you start
Yes.
refreshing, and then you refresh just 2 seconds ago, and you do it again, and then you put your
Mhm.
phone down, and then 2 seconds later you pick it back up, and you open all the apps and you look at it. I
And you're
mean,
like,
it's just
"Why?"
like this
Yeah,
addicting thing, and it's
it is.
because it's hijacking our rewards system with the dopamine. So we keep thinking we're going to get like some special thing pop up because we're looking for that fix, but
Yeah.
it never really happens. And that hijacks your reward pathways. And so then you get less joy when you're out like doing something that you normally love to do. Like you get less joy from hanging out with your friends, and that's why
Yeah.
we're grabbing our phones while we're sitting there right with our friends and we're like, oh, I'm going to scroll through this, but I'm sitting
Mhm.
here, I have a face to face conversation with someone. And so it's just, these substances can just really hijack our reward systems. And luckily, magic mushrooms are just not like that. It's not addicting.
And do they like, how much do they help with that? Because like, I like, I still comfort eat,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. Like, does the microdosing help with that kind of behavioral change or
It does. Yeah. I was just on a big microdosing forum where we had a panel discussion with some people who've been microdosing for quite some time. And we had some experts on there. And I was moderating the panel. And so many of them talked about things like behavior changes, whether that was numbing out with food, comfort eating,
Mhm.
or someone talked about alcohol cessation and, moving away from constantly drinking. And it can happen just because my theory is that because psychedelics tend to make us feel more okay with our present selves. And so
Mhm.
even so in terms of microdosing too, you're okay just more living in the moment rather than reaching for the thing that numbs you out. Now that doesn't mean that you don't have to do some work. Obviously you have to consciously make choices to
Mhm.
abstain from the thing that you were using to numb out, but you may be less likely to crave that thing, whether that's the comfort food or it's online shopping if that's something that you're like overdoing or whatever, and
Yeah.
you're just using that to you're adding things to your cart to numb out, right? It happens. And so if I think that microdosing can help you really lean into those behavior changes a little bit more because again, it really helps you just function in the present, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, and I mean, thankfully, laws are starting to loosen up a little bit in some areas, but it's still a Schedule One drug, so that's an issue.
Mhm.
Um, and you make a really good point regarding fentanyl because we've demonized fentanyl like to the umpteenth degree, and it's like, wait a minute, let's take a look in the mirror. This is what we did with crack cocaine. This is what we did with
Mhm.
heroin. We turned these into these evil entities. We criminalized it, and we've destroyed more lives by attacking the drug users and making and demonizing the drug. And I'm with you. I think we should take the way of Portugal and just
Yeah.
decriminalize all of it.
Right, because if you think about it, the reason that we have fentanyl on the streets, like fentanyl is used in the hospitals as, a pain control drug and everything like that, and so that's why it was invented in the first place. But
Mhm.
why is it being illegally, shuttled all over? It's because it's easier to transport and sell than it is heroin is. You'll drug dealers just have an easier time getting it
Mhm.
out there. But it's a deadly drug when taken in the wrong context, not in a hospital mainly,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
or in a prescription situation that it's controlled and safe. And so it's out there because we criminalize heroin. And if we had never done that, then fentanyl likely wouldn't be out there. And we
Mhm.
can think back to so Hillary Agro brought this to my attention, and then because she's just such a brilliant activist, but she was talking about what's called the iron law of prohibition. So if you
Mm.
look at anything we've any substance that we've prohibited, all we end up with is a worse substance. So when we prohibited alcohol way back when, not that I was alive then, but what did we get? We got like extremely bad, dangerous moonshine that made people
Yes.
go
Yep.
blind, right?
Mhm.
And then we can think about it too in the context of
And
cannabis.
that, that's not that's not a figure of speech. People like
Yeah, no, people
literally.
literally did go blind.
Yeah.
Yes,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
wild. And then we can think about this happening too with cannabis. So,
Mhm.
we've outlawed it before when cannabis was broadly illegal, even though we've got legalization for a large swath of the nation. But
Mhm.
if we think back to the early days before we started to get some of that legalization, people started to develop some of these synthetic versions of cannabis. Like I feel like one was called K2 or something like that. People died from that, if I recall correctly, or they were at least hospitalized. But I think there were a couple of deaths from some of these synthetic versions of cannabis. No
Okay.
one's
Yeah.
actually ever died from normal cannabis, like normal
Sure.
THC.
Mhm.
And then we also have a lot of problems now. There's actually research out there now to support that in states where cannabis is illegal, which is where
Mhm.
I live, it's illegal in Tennessee. I mean, you can get CBD but now we've got Delta 8, right? And so that's what everyone is turning to. And so in states like Tennessee, we actually have more emergency visits for things like Delta 8 or any kind of synthetic cannabis, because Delta 8 is technically synthetic by the time you extract THC from a hemp plant. It's relatively synthetic in most cases, at least
Okay.
Delta 8, the Delta 8 version is. And so we actually have more emergency room visits of young kids getting into Delta 8 or other synthetic cannabis rather than if they in states where normal THC, Delta 9 is
Mhm.
legal, they turn to that and they're not being hospitalized for that. And so it's really interesting to me that the more we prohibit drugs, the more we actually create crime and problems and overdose deaths and emergency room visits and all of that. If we just let people do what they're going to do,
Mhm.
uh, that would work itself out. And I know that's a strong stance to take, but I'm a firm believer, and the research shows it.
Yeah. As far as embracing psychedelics, cross sexually, um, w- what is the difference between using a a drug to enhance one's romantic sexual life and just
Yeah,
a sexual life? Because the studies have shown that people who have sex are generally happier, right? There's more.
sure.
But is there a difference when you're using a drug like that? Is there a risk, especially for women, when it's non-loving and just sexual?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I would say that the thing that that's really important to consider is that a psychedelic can make you more vulnerable and more. I mean, obviously, it makes you more vulnerable, but it also makes you more open to suggestibility. So
Mhm.
that comes back to that rebus model. We're trying to get beliefs in our brain. It's much easier to do when you're on a psychedelic, and that can happen with if there's someone in power over you. That can happen. Like sexual assault can happen, of course, in that context. And I mean, it can happen in any industry. So I certainly am not vilifying the psychedelic industry for it, but it is happening in the
Mhm.
psychedelic industry too. And so I just think that's a really important consideration. And sexual assault happens to all people of all genders. It's not just a female problem
Mhm.
or woman problem, and it's often underreported in men. And so, that's a really important thing to consider too. But in terms of like, can psychedelics enhance your sex life? If we're talking about consensual sex here,
Mhm.
yeah, I believe so. I did talk to a really wonderful neuroscientist. Her name is Dr. Michelle Ross, and we talked about she had written about psychedelics and sex, and so I reached out to her to interview her, and she
Mhm.
had some really great insights, and mainly that she was saying that certainly going if a woman is struggling with sexual functioning, lack low libido, all of that, if you go off and do your own psychedelic journey and then come back and like are with your partner, you may find that you're able to more voice your needs, or you might feel more
Mhm.
confident in the bedroom. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. It's not that psychedelics, or it's not that psilocybin is going to be like some sort of classic aphrodisiac. It's not really.
Not chocolate,
Um,
right?
yeah, it's not like chocolate, or like I guess
Yeah.
people call it oysters and
Was there
aphrodisiac.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not like that. But the other thing, there are two things that are protective against female sexual dysfunction. One of them is intimate partner communication. And so
Mhm.
if you can facilitate that intimacy by having that oceanic boundlessness experience,
Mhm.
that could facilitate more intimate partner communication with your partner. And it's not
Okay.
that you have to again do psilocybin with your partner. You can go off and do your own journey and come back and then feel more connected just
I
naturally
see.
because of that. And then the other thing that is protective against female sexual dysfunction, and again, this isn't a guarantee that is protective, but having a positive body image can really, really help be protective against female sexual dysfunction. And so we
Yeah.
do know that psilocybin is being studied right now for eating disorders. And specifically, they're doing clinical trials right now for anorexia nervosa, and we're
Mhm.
getting promising results from that, learning that psychedelics do tend to help with body image in some contexts. And it's helpful with binge eating disorder. I believe that it's being studied for that right now as well. And so I think that there's a lot of promise there to help with female sexual dysfunction, or help people boost their sex lives
Yeah.
in in a safe way, as long as they're not being as long as there's not someone in a position of power over you, and they're, like a therapist or something,
Mhm.
that is getting you on your psilocybin and then is, assaulting you. Obviously, that's a bad
Sure.
thing. So,
Yeah, and it's like maybe partners should not necessarily do a trip together, right? Like maybe they can, but maybe that's not the best thing, and that's okay.
yeah, and I think that's okay. I think you can do a trip with your partner if you've been with your partner for a while. Like, this isn't a new relationship, somebody you just met 5 minutes ago at the bar. It's
Right.
probably not the
That's not a
best
partner. Right?
the best
Yeah.
situation to get
Right.
into. But yeah, like I interviewed a couple, or I interviewed a woman, and her stories in my book, where she and her partner do use psilocybin together. They've had a long relationship and then worked
Mhm.
up towards doing that, and they set boundaries around it.
But
And
they didn't
you
just
know
jump into it.
yeah, they're not just jumping into it,
Right. Yeah.
and stuff. But, as an example of someone who didn't do it with her partner, so I'm married, and
Mhm.
I went, did psilocybin with a random dude at the cabin in the woods, not a random dude, but I'm just making fun of it.
Gotcha. Yep.
But yeah, I went and did psilocybin elsewhere, and then I came back and I felt like exponentially more connected to my husband. And it wasn't that I felt like we were disconnected before.
Mhm.
I just didn't realize the level of connection that I could get to. And I felt it's not like he did anything. I just
Yeah.
went and like did psilocybin and came back. And it was just all me. It was like the walls had gone down for me. And that was really beautiful. It
Yeah,
still is.
it's kind of like I feel like we get a buildup of static,
Mhm.
and and just little by little by little, and you're just living with it. And every once
Yeah.
in a while, to be able to kind of clear that out
Yes.
and then open up. Yeah,
Right. It's this beautiful empathogen that helps us feel connected to people.
it's an
And
pathogen. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Awesome. All right, Jennifer, thank you so
Yeah.
much. This flew by like
I
crazy
know,
fast.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Um,
having me.
Totally. If you can leave us with one thought, anything at all, doesn't even have to be the subject. What would it be?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so my guide shared this really profound snippet of information with me, and it actually comes from a poem, and I can't remember the name of the poet, but it is the love that you withhold is the pain that you carry. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing because it's so true. Like when we are withholding love or when we are putting up walls so that we don't get hurt,
Mhm.
it's because we've been hurt before and we carry pain related to that. And if we can let go of those walls, then we open up all this love, not only for ourselves, but for others. And so I felt like that was a really beautiful
Yeah, it's like Simon and Garfunkel. I am a
thing.
rock. I am an island, right? Like
Right. Yes.
if you're a rock, people are just hurting themselves against you. If you're an
Hmm.
island, people have to do all this effort to try to get to you. You're
Right.
causing a lot of pain. Yeah,
Yes.
I can understand
Yes.
that.
And it
Jennifer,
emanates from your pain.
yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So, if you want to
Thank
find out
you.
more about Jennifer and her work, go to jenniferchesak.com. Jennifer, two N's, and Chesak, CHESAK.com. And of course, on Instagram at Jen with one N, Chesak, at Jen Chesak, Instagram. Jen, thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
Have a good night.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. I really appreciate you as always. If you are listening on iTunes, please rate and comment, give a review. I'd really appreciate that. All that feedback helps continue to grow this podcast, and it is growing it steadily. And that's thanks to you. I really appreciate it. And for everyone who missed tonight's show, you can always catch the live rebroadcast on the UnX Network at 11 p.m. Pacific Time, 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Fridays. Until next time, everyone, peace and love. And of course, live in the mystery.